The announcement that spread through the Virginia countryside in the spring of 1803 seemed designed more to embarrass potential suitors than to actually find a husband for Thomas Hartwick's daughter. Hartwick was one of the wealthiest landowners in the Shenandoah Valley, a man whose fortune had been built through a combination of inheritance, shrewd land speculation, and the labor of more than 200 enslaved people working his tobacco plantations and breeding horses that commanded premium prices throughout the American South, and even in Europe, where Virginia bloodlines were prized for their speed and endurance. His daughter Catherine was 23 years old, approaching the age where unmarried women began to be considered unfortunate spinsters rather than desirable brides, and possessed of a reputation for intelligence and independence that had apparently discouraged the kind of men her father considered suitable matches for someone of her social standing and his wealth. The challenge Hartwick announced at a gathering of Virginia's planter class was characteristically theatrical and calculated to generate exactly the kind of attention he wanted. Talk throughout the region that would attract ambitious young men, while simultaneously allowing him to maintain standards that would exclude anyone he deemed unworthy. "Gentlemen," he'd proclaimed during a dinner at his estate that brought together 24 of the most prominent families in the valley, "I have a magnificent stallion that has proven impossible to break. 3 professional horse trainers have attempted to tame him, and all 3 have failed. One broke his arm, another suffered a concussion, and the third wisely gave up after the beast threw him 5 times in a single afternoon. This animal is worth a fortune if he can be controlled and bred, but he's worthless if he remains wild. So I'm making an offer to any man brave and skilled enough to succeed where professionals have failed. Whoever can break this stallion to saddle and bridle within 1 month's time will have my daughter's hand in marriage, along with a dowry of $10,000 and partnership in my horse breeding operation." The murmur that spread through the assembled company carried notes of shock, calculation, and in some cases poorly concealed amusement at Hartwick's audacity in essentially auctioning his daughter to whoever could perform a task that professional trainers had already declared impossible. Catherine herself was present at the dinner, seated at the opposite end of the long table from her father. Her expression carefully neutral in ways that suggested years of practice at concealing her actual thoughts and feelings while maintaining the appearance of dutiful daughter, accepting her father's decisions without complaint or resistance. She was striking rather than conventionally beautiful, tall for a woman of her era, with dark hair and eyes that suggested intelligence and wit that her father apparently found more concerning than valuable in a daughter he needed to marry off to secure family alliances and business connections. The challenge attracted exactly the kind of attention Hartwick had intended, with young men from prominent families throughout Virginia traveling to his estate to attempt to tame the stallion and win the spectacular prize of marriage to a wealthy man's daughter and substantial dowry and business partnership. The horse itself was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure, a massive black stallion standing 17 hands high, with wild eyes and temperament that made even experienced horsemen hesitate before attempting to approach him. He'd been captured as a 3-year-old running wild in the mountains, the offspring of escaped domestic horses that had formed feral herds in remote areas where human presence was minimal, and where the animals had returned to something approaching their original wild nature before domestication. Hartwick had purchased the stallion thinking his size and evident strength would make him valuable for breeding if he could be tamed, but 2 years of effort by various trainers had produced no progress. The horse remained as wild and uncontrollable as the day he'd been captured, confined to a large paddock where he could be fed and observed but not approached safely. The suitors who attempted the challenge over the following weeks universally failed, though their failures took various forms. Some approached the task with aggression and force, trying to dominate the horse through superior strength and violent assertion of human authority, which resulted in the horse fighting back with equal violence and the suitors retreating bruised and sometimes seriously injured. Others tried gentler approaches based on patience and gradual habituation, spending days in the paddock simply being present without attempting to touch the stallion. But these efforts produced no results within the 1-month timeline Hartwick had established for the competition. By the 3rd week of the challenge, 17 men had attempted and failed to make any meaningful progress with the horse, and the whole affair was becoming something of a joke throughout the region. Speculation grew that Hartwick had deliberately created an impossible challenge as a way to avoid actually having to give his daughter to anyone while maintaining appearance of being open to suitable marriages. Catherine herself seemed to regard the entire spectacle with barely concealed contempt, attending the various attempts as her father insisted, but making no secret through her expressions and occasional comments to other observers that she found the whole performance absurd and demeaning. She'd made clear in private conversations that she had no interest in marrying any of the men who'd attempted the challenge, which was perhaps fortunate given that none of them had succeeded, and that her father showed no signs of lowering his standards or extending the deadline beyond the original 1-month limit. What no one among the planter class who'd been watching and speculating and attempting the challenge had considered was that the solution might come from someone outside their social circle entirely. Living on Hartwick's estate among the more than 200 enslaved people who worked his various operations was a young man named Isaac, who was notable primarily for his apparent unsuitability for the heavy agricultural labor that characterized most plantation work. Isaac was in his early 20s, stood barely 5 feet 6 inches tall, and possessed a thin, wiry build that suggested chronic undernourishment rather than natural body type. He looked like someone who'd never had quite enough to eat during crucial developmental years, leaving him smaller and lighter than he might have become under better circumstances. His assigned work on the plantation was tending the extensive vegetable gardens that fed the estate's population, a task that required knowledge and patience rather than physical strength, and that allowed him to avoid the brutal tobacco field labor that destroyed so many enslaved people's bodies through repetitive stress and constant exposure to the elements. What made Isaac unusual beyond his small stature and garden work assignment was his relationship with animals. He'd grown up on the plantation, born to parents who'd been enslaved there, and he'd spent his childhood observing and gradually working with the horses that were the foundation of Hartwick's breeding operation and commercial success. While other children played or were put to work in the fields as soon as they were old enough to be minimally useful, Isaac had haunted the stables and paddocks, watching how horses moved and interacted, learning to read their body language and moods, understanding instinctively how to approach them in ways that didn't trigger fear or aggression. The stable hands who managed Hartwick's breeding operation had recognized Isaac's natural talent and had allowed him to help with basic tasks, cleaning stalls, distributing feed, eventually assisting with grooming and basic handling of the gentler horses in ways that gave him practical experience that most enslaved people never had opportunity to develop. By his early 20s, Isaac had accumulated more practical knowledge about horses than many professional trainers possessed. Though his knowledge was observational and experiential, rather than based on formal training or systematic instruction, he understood how horses thought and what motivated their behavior, how to read the subtle signals that indicated fear or curiosity or readiness to trust, how to move around horses in ways that communicated calm confidence rather than threat or nervousness that would make the animals defensive. He'd been present in the paddock area during several of the suitors' failed attempts to tame the wild stallion, watching from positions where he wouldn't be noticed or ordered to leave, observing both the horses' reactions and the men's approaches, forming opinions about what wasn't working and what might work better if someone actually thought about the problem from the horse's perspective, rather than approaching it as contest of wills or test of human dominance. After watching the 17th failure, a particularly brutal attempt by a young man from a prominent Richmond family who'd brought a whip and had tried to beat the stallion into submission, which had resulted in the horse kicking him hard enough to crack several ribs and sent him home in a wagon because he couldn't ride, Isaac made a decision that was either inspired courage or suicidal foolishness, depending on whether it succeeded. He approached Hartwick directly, walking up to the main house in the evening after the day's work had ended, and asking the house slaves to convey a message that he wanted to speak with the master about the horse challenge. This was itself a transgressive act. Enslaved people were expected to communicate through overseers rather than approaching owners directly, and requesting audience with someone of Hartwick's status over what might seem like pretension or impertinence could easily result in punishment rather than actual conversation. But Hartwick was apparently amused rather than offended by the audacity of a garden slave requesting to speak with him about a challenge that had defeated 17 men from prominent families. He agreed to see Isaac on the front porch of the main house, a semi-public space that was neither fully inside the private domains nor completely outside. A liminal area where the meeting could occur without fully violating social protocols about enslaved people's access to owners' private spaces. Isaac stood on the porch in his work clothes, barefoot as was standard for enslaved people even in spring when the ground was still cold at night, and faced Hartwick with a combination of deference that was socially necessary and directness that suggested he'd thought carefully about what he wanted to say, and was committed to saying it regardless of the risks. "Master Hartwick, I've been watching the men who've been trying to tame the black stallion. And I think they're all approaching the problem wrong. They're treating it like a fight, like the horse is an enemy that needs to be conquered through force or tricked through patience into accepting human control. But horses don't think like that. They're not enemies. They're prey animals who are terrified of threats and who respond to gentleness and consistency and understanding their nature rather than trying to dominate them. Isaac paused, reading Hartwick's expression to see if he should continue or if he'd already crossed a line that would result in dismissal or worse. Hartwick's face showed curiosity rather than anger, so Isaac pressed forward. I think I can tame that horse, but I'd need to do it my way, which is different from what all those other men have been trying. And I'd need you to agree that if I succeed, you'll keep your word about the prize, that whoever tames the horse gets your daughter's hand and the dowry and the partnership. The request was so outrageous, an enslaved man asking to compete for prizes that were explicitly meant for free men of good family, effectively asking to marry into planter class and receive wealth and status that should be impossible for someone of his legal and social position, that Hartwick's initial reaction was laughter. But the laughter faded as he studied Isaac's expression and realized the young man was completely serious. That this wasn't joke or performance, but genuine proposal based on confidence that he could succeed where 17 others had failed. Hartwick's calculation was quick and cynical. Allowing an enslaved person to attempt the challenge cost him nothing since the attempt would obviously fail. And the failure would reinforce his position that the challenge was genuinely impossible, and that he couldn't be blamed for his daughter remaining unmarried when even expanding the competition to include enslaved people hadn't produced anyone capable of taming the horse. You understand what you're asking for? Hartwick said, his tone carrying amusement that suggested he was already anticipating how the story of the presumptuous slave would be told at future gatherings. If you fail, you'll be a laughingstock. And if somehow you succeeded, which I don't believe is possible, you'd be claiming marriage to a white woman of good family, which is illegal in Virginia, and which would make you extremely unpopular among people who could make your life very difficult. Isaac nodded, showing he'd considered these consequences. I understand, but I still want to try, and if I succeed, I want your word that you'll honor the terms you announced, that whoever tames the horse gets the prize you promised, without changing the rules after the fact because you don't like who won. Hartwick considered for a moment, then made his decision with the same theatrical flair he'd shown in announcing the original challenge. Very well, you have the same 1 month that everyone else gets, starting tomorrow morning. If you can tame that horse to saddle and bridle, meaning I can ride him safely without being thrown, then you'll have won according to the terms I set. What happens after that regarding the actual prizes will address if you somehow manage to succeed, which I don't believe will happen. But I give you my word that I won't interfere with your attempt or punish you for trying, regardless of whether you succeed or fail. It was a calculated wager on Hartwick's part. He was risking nothing since he was certain the attempt would fail. And the entertainment value of watching an enslaved person humiliate himself trying to accomplish what 17 free men had failed at would provide amusement for himself and his peers. Isaac began his attempt the following morning, and from the first moments it was clear his approach was fundamentally different from everything that had been tried before. Rather than entering the paddock with equipment and intention to immediately begin handling the horse, Isaac simply sat down just inside the fence and remained there, motionless and silent, making no attempt to approach the stallion or even to look directly at him. The horse, accustomed to men entering the paddock with ropes and bridles and aggressive intentions, was initially confused by this passive presence, and he stayed at the far side of the paddock watching Isaac with suspicion, but without the immediate defensive aggression that had characterized his responses to previous suitors. Isaac maintained this position for the entire first day, sitting quietly, occasionally shifting position but never standing or moving toward the horse, letting the animal grow accustomed to his presence as something that existed in the space but posed no threat. By the second day, the horse's curiosity was overcoming his defensive wariness, and he began moving closer to where Isaac sat, approaching cautiously and then retreating when Isaac shifted position, gradually testing whether this strange human who didn't chase or threaten was actually safe to be near. Isaac continued his patient waiting, never reaching out or attempting to touch the horse when he approached, simply existing as calm presence that the horse could investigate at his own pace and comfort level. On the third day, the horse approached close enough that Isaac could have touched him if he'd reached out. But Isaac didn't. He remained still, letting the horse make all the decisions about distance and interaction. The horse sniffed Isaac's hair and clothing, investigating this unusual human with the same careful assessment that horses use to determine whether something in their environment is dangerous or benign. By the end of the first week, the horse was comfortable enough with Isaac's presence that he would graze near where Isaac sat, no longer treating him as potential threat, but as simply part of the paddock's environment. Something familiar and non-dangerous that didn't require constant vigilance. Isaac began introducing small movements, standing slowly, walking a few steps, sitting down again in different location, always moving deliberately and calmly so that the horse could see and assess each action without being startled by sudden changes. The horse would watch these movements but no longer fled or displayed the defensive aggression that had characterized his responses to everyone else who'd entered the paddock. He was learning that Isaac's movements were predictable and non-threatening, that this particular human could be trusted not to suddenly chase or attempt to trap him. In the second week, Isaac began the actual process of building relationship that would eventually allow handling. He brought food, not just the standard hay and grain that was always available in the paddock, but special treats that the horse found particularly appealing, and he would place these treats on the ground and then step away, letting the horse approach and eat without any demand for proximity or interaction. Gradually, Isaac reduced the distance he moved away after placing treats, until the horse was comfortable eating from locations just a few feet from where Isaac stood. Then Isaac began holding treats in his open palm, arm extended, but body position relaxed and non-threatening, giving the horse the option to approach and take food directly from his hand if he chose to trust that closely. The horse's first acceptance of food directly from Isaac's hand on the 10th day represented a breakthrough in the trust-building process. The animal was demonstrating willingness to make himself vulnerable by bringing his head close to a human, trusting that Isaac wouldn't use that proximity to attempt capture or harm. From that point, progress accelerated. Isaac began touching the horse while he ate from Isaac's hand. First, just brief contact with neck or shoulder, then longer strokes that allowed the horse to grow accustomed to human touch associated with positive experiences rather than with force or constraint. Within days, Isaac could run his hands over most of the horse's body while the animal stood calmly. Having learned through consistent experience that Isaac's touch was gentle and non-threatening, rather than prelude to violence or forced control. By the end of the third week, Isaac had progressed to introducing equipment. First, just draping cloth across the horse's back to accustom him to the sensation of something resting there. Then gradually introducing saddle blanket, then saddle itself, always moving at the horse's pace rather than forcing acceptance of new sensations faster than the animal was comfortable with. The horse initially shied away from these new elements, but Isaac's patient approach of introduction withdrawal, reintroduction reward, eventually made each piece of equipment familiar and non-threatening. He applied the same patient, gradual approach to the bridle, first just letting the horse investigate the equipment, then touching his face with it, then slipping it on briefly, and removing it immediately, gradually extending the time the bridle remained in place until the horse accepted it as simply part of the normal experience rather than as alarming constraint. The final test came on the 28th day of the month-long challenge period. Isaac led the fully tacked horse around the paddock, with the animal following willingly rather than resisting or attempting to flee. Then, with movements that were slow and deliberate so the horse could see and understand what was happening at every stage, Isaac mounted, placing his foot in the stirrup, pulling himself up into the saddle, settling his weight onto the horse's back in ways that communicated calm confidence rather than aggressive domination. The horse stood still for a moment, processing this new experience of carrying weight, then began walking at Isaac's gentle urging. Within an hour, Isaac was riding the supposedly untamable stallion around the paddock at walk, trot, and eventually canter, with the horse responding to subtle cues from reins and legs rather than fighting or attempting to throw his rider. The transformation of the wild, dangerous stallion into a responsive riding horse in less than a month, accomplished by someone whom nobody had taken seriously as potential competitor, generated reactions that ranged from amazement to disbelief to barely concealed fury among those who'd invested their reputations in attempting the challenge and failing. Hartwick himself was forced to acknowledge that Isaac had succeeded according to the terms that had been set. The horse was tamed to saddle and bridle and could be ridden safely. But acknowledging success was very different from actually providing the promised prizes, and Hartwick immediately faced the dilemma he'd created through his theatrical challenge and his careless agreement to let an enslaved person attempt it. The promise had been public and specific. Whoever tamed the horse would receive Catherine's hand in marriage, $10,000 dowry, and partnership in the horse breeding operation. Isaac had unquestionably tamed the horse under the terms that had been set. But actually giving those prizes to an enslaved black man was legally impossible and socially unthinkable. Marriage between black and white people was illegal in Virginia, which provided legal grounds for denying that particular element of the prize. But the other elements, the money and the partnership, were legally possible even if socially outrageous. And Hartwick had given his word in front of witnesses that whoever succeeded would receive what had been promised. The resolution of this dilemma would reveal both the limits of Hartwick's honor and the unexpected agency of his daughter Catherine, who'd been treated throughout the entire affair as passive prize to be awarded, rather than as person with her own thoughts and preferences about her circumstances. Catherine had watched Isaac's work with the horse over the month-long challenge period, initially with the same skepticism and amusement that characterized most observers' reactions to an enslaved person attempting what free men had failed to achieve. But as the days passed and Isaac's patient, intelligent approach produced visible progress, while all the aggressive domination attempts by suitors had produced only failure and injury, Catherine's assessment shifted from amusement to respect, to something approaching admiration for Isaac's competence, and for his understanding of how to solve problems through observation and adaptation, rather than through force. When her father began the expected process of explaining why the promises couldn't actually be kept, despite Isaac's success, citing legal prohibitions on interracial marriage, social impossibility of elevating enslaved person to partnership status, various technical arguments about how the challenge terms should be interpreted, Catherine surprised everyone by intervening on Isaac's behalf. "Father, you made a public promise to multiple witnesses that whoever tamed the horse would receive the prizes you described. Isaac tamed the horse under the terms you set. If you don't honor your word because you don't like who won, then everyone in Virginia will know that Thomas Hartwick's promises mean nothing when keeping them becomes inconvenient. Your reputation, which you value enormously, will be destroyed by your own dishonesty." The argument put Hartwick in an impossible position. Catherine was correct that breaking his public promise would destroy his reputation for honor, which was essential to his social standing and business relationships in a culture where a gentleman's word was supposed to be absolutely binding. But keeping the promise as literally stated was equally impossible given legal and social constraints. The resolution Hartwick eventually proposed was a compromise that tried to navigate between these incompatible requirements. He would honor the financial element of the promise by paying Isaac the $10,000 and by granting him freedom rather than partnership, since legal partnership with an enslaved person was impossible. The marriage element would obviously not happen as originally stated, but Catherine would receive an equivalent dowry to establish herself independently if she chose not to marry any of the conventional suitors who'd failed the challenge. But Catherine proposed a different resolution that revealed she'd been thinking about her own situation and options more carefully than her father had understood. "I have a counter-proposal, Father. You free Isaac immediately and provide him with funds sufficient to establish himself as independent horse trainer with his own operation. You give me control of my dowry rather than requiring that it transfer to whatever husband you eventually pressure me into accepting. And you acknowledge publicly that Isaac won the challenge according to the terms you set, which establishes his reputation as extraordinarily skilled horse trainer who succeeded where 17 free men failed. You get to maintain your reputation for honoring your word while avoiding the social complications of actually having me marry Isaac. I get independence rather than being forced into marriage with some fool who couldn't even tame a horse. And Isaac gets freedom and opportunity to use his actual capabilities, rather than being wasted on garden work." The proposal was carefully constructed to give Hartwick a way out of the impossible situation, while actually providing substantive benefits to the people who deserved them. Hartwick recognized it as the best resolution he was likely to achieve that would preserve his reputation while avoiding social catastrophe, and he agreed with the kind of bad grace that suggested he understood he'd been outmaneuvered by his daughter's intelligence and by the enslaved person whose capabilities he'd underestimated. Isaac was manumitted with appropriate legal documentation, provided with $5,000 as modified prize for winning the challenge, and publicly acknowledged as the only person who'd succeeded in taming the supposedly untamable stallion. Catherine received control of her dowry, $10,000 that would allow her genuine independence rather than the theoretical independence of unmarried women still living under father's authority. And both of them were freed from the future Hartwick had been trying to arrange through his theatrical challenge. What followed over the subsequent months would surprise everyone who'd witnessed the challenge and its resolution. Because Isaac and Catherine maintained contact and gradually developed relationship that was far more equal and genuine than the marriages most women of Catherine's class experienced. Isaac established himself as independent horse trainer with reputation built on his success with Hartwick's stallion, and wealthy owners throughout Virginia began seeking his services for horses that conventional trainers couldn't handle. Catherine used her financial independence to establish herself in a small property near Isaac's training operation, ostensibly to pursue her own interests in horse breeding, but actually because she found Isaac's company and conversation far more interesting than the society of the men her father had wanted her to marry. Their relationship remained ambiguous and undefined by conventional categories. They weren't married because interracial marriage remained illegal, and because both of them valued the independence that legal marriage would have complicated in different ways. But they were partners in a business venture that combined Catherine's capital and social connections with Isaac's extraordinary talent for understanding and training horses. They were friends who respected each other's intelligence and capabilities in ways that were rare across the racial and gender divisions that structured Virginia society. And gradually, carefully, in ways that had to remain hidden from public view to avoid legal consequences and social destruction, they became lovers who built a life together that defied every convention about how relationships were supposed to work across the boundaries of race and legal status. The horse breeding operation they built together over the following decades became one of the most successful in Virginia. Known for producing exceptionally well-trained horses that commanded premium prices, and for Isaac's almost supernatural ability to work with difficult animals that other trainers declared hopeless. Catherine managed the business aspects, negotiating sales, maintaining breeding records, handling finances, while Isaac focused on the training work that was his genuine genius. They employed both free black workers and paid white assistants who were willing to work under Isaac's direction, creating an operation that functioned according to capability, rather than according to racial hierarchies that normally determined who could hold authority over whom. They never had children, whether by choice or circumstance, which perhaps made their unusual arrangement slightly less scandalous than it might otherwise have been in a society obsessed with racial purity and bloodlines. They lived separately in adjacent properties to maintain appearances and avoid the legal complications that would have come from openly cohabiting across racial lines. But anyone who spent time around their operation understood that they were partners in every meaningful sense, even if legal and social constraints prevented them from acknowledging the full nature of their relationship publicly. Isaac died in 1847 at approximately 66 years old, having lived to see his training methods influence a generation of horse trainers, and having accumulated enough wealth through his work that he died a prosperous man, rather than in the poverty that characterized most free black people's lives in the antebellum South. Catherine outlived him by 12 years, continuing to run the breeding operation and maintaining Isaac's reputation and training methods as the foundation of the business's continued success. At her death in 1859, just before the Civil War that would finally destroy the legal framework of slavery that had shaped both their lives, she left detailed instructions that the operation should be sold and the proceeds used to establish a school for free black children, specifically to teach them skills that would allow them to support themselves through capability, rather than having to depend on white employers' willingness to hire them. The story of how the skinniest slave won the Lord's challenge through understanding rather than strength, and how that victory led to genuine partnership with the Lord's daughter, who recognized intelligence and capability when she saw it, became a legend that was told in different ways by different communities. Among enslaved people and free black communities, it was told a story of how intelligence and patience could sometimes create opportunities that force and aggression couldn't achieve. How true capability would eventually be recognized even in a system designed to deny it. How relationships built on mutual respect could transcend the legal and social barriers that were supposed to make such relationships impossible. Among progressive white communities, particularly those opposed to slavery, it was told as evidence that the supposed natural hierarchies that justified slavery were fictions, that enslaved people possessed capabilities equal to or exceeding those of free people when given opportunity to demonstrate them, that relationships across racial lines could be genuine and valuable rather than inherently exploitative or degraded. The more cynical interpretation, which historians would later emphasize, was that Isaac and Catherine's story was exceptional precisely because it was so rare, That one enslaved person winning freedom and success through extraordinary talent didn't change the fundamental reality that millions of others remained in bondage, without any such opportunities. That one woman achieving independence through her father's careless promise didn't alter the systematic subordination of women in a patriarchal society. That one successful interracial partnership didn't challenge the legal and social structures that made such partnerships effectively impossible for anyone without the specific combination of wealth, talent, and fortunate circumstances that Isaac and Catherine possessed. But within the story's specific context, what mattered was that Isaac had demonstrated that the qualities that actually mattered for solving problems, patience, observation, understanding, adaptation, were completely unrelated to the physical strength and aggressive dominance that men like Hartwick's suitors had assumed were essential for controlling horses and for succeeding at any challenge worth undertaking. That Catherine had recognized those qualities when she saw them and had been willing to ally with someone society said she should consider inferior, rather than accepting marriage to someone whose only qualification was belonging to the correct race and class. That together they'd built something genuine that lasted decades, and that succeeded economically and personally despite all the legal and social barriers designed to prevent exactly that kind of relationship from existing. The skinny slave who won the challenge through understanding the horse rather than trying to dominate it. The Lord's daughter who recognized that the most capable person to partner with wasn't necessarily the one society said she should marry. The relationship they built that defied conventional categories and that created something valuable despite, or perhaps because of, its refusal to conform to expected patterns. That was the story, and whether it was told as inspiring exception or as tragic reminder of how rare such exceptions were, it remained a story worth remembering about how people found ways to be more than what the systems they lived within said they could be.